So as we are nearing the end of the 1800s, the United States has become a very diverse nation in terms of immigration. More people are coming into the United States and from different parts of the world than had in previous times. And they are coming for a variety of reasons. Some are seeking to create a new life for themselves. Some are escaping situations in which they would have been persecuted in their home country. Some are coming to the United States with the goal of working for a few years, earning some wealth, and then returning to their native country. And by the end of the 1800s, the United States, which has become an industrial nation, has been producing and outproducing much of the rest of the world. So the United States expanded its economy over the late 19th century. American leaders grew interested in international agricultural and industrial markets. Between 1870 and 1905, U.S. exports jumped from 500 million to 1.5 billion. Now, exports are products that are being shipped outside of the United States. So the United States is selling a lot of stuff, different types of things, to many different parts of the world. Most American exports went to Europe and Canada, but businessmen believed that the markets in Latin America and Asia also held great promise. In part because the American economy was in a boom and bust cycle throughout the last 30 years of the 19th century, businessmen grew increasingly concerned about the stability of domestic markets and believed that selling to foreign markets would help to counterbalance the economic and social unrest at home. Now, this boom and bust cycle is just very simply, there will be times when the economy is good and more people are working than are unemployed, and we as a nation are selling a lot of products, and there isn't really a lot of national debt or personal debt. And in a bust cycle, we see the opposite. So there will be layoffs, there will be people who have a lot of debt, there will be companies that may close or have to downsize. And this just is a circle and it just repeats. Now, at the same time, there has been some unrest here in the United States. Some of that unrest is connected to race relations, and some of that unrest is connected to changes in the United States in terms of immigration and migration. Additionally, we have some very interesting political ideas that have been brought up in the United States, particularly this idea of populism that encourages political leaders to listen to the average person, the everyday guy. Now, among the markets that businessmen were interested in was Hawaii, and this was an interesting area at the time because American missionary, agricultural, and economic influence in Hawaii had been increasing since the 1820s. In 1877, the United States entered into an agreement with the white Hawaiians that gave the United States rights to the naval base at Pearl Harbor. Now, if you're wondering what are white Hawaiians, these are people who are Americans but had moved to Hawaii and had been living in Hawaii for a while. They had businesses in Hawaii and families and lives in Hawaii. Now, the native Hawaiians were really uncomfortable with this growing influence of these white leaders, particularly white sugar planters. Remember, sugar is an important commodity that can be sold for a high profit, and it can be sold around the world. In 1891, plantation owners and a contingent of U.S. Marines ousted the Queen of Hawaii who had a nationalist government. This laid the groundwork for a treaty of annexation with the United States that President Grover Cleveland eventually withdrew. Now, even though this was withdrawn, planters do remain in power in Hawaii, and they wait for an opportunity to be able to be annexed to the United States. Now, if you look at this chart, what you can see, hopefully you can see, is that the U.S. exports and imports are outlined from 1870 to 1910. And remember, exports is the products that are being made in the United States and being sold to somewhere other than within the United States. And imports are products that are being bought and brought into the United States. So if you're looking at this bar graph, what you can see is from 1870 through 1910. The United States is selling more products than it is purchasing. And this is important because what this means is that more money is being made and kept in the United States because we are not, as a nation, purchasing a lot of supplies and products from other parts of the world. Now, the markets were not the only reason that people wanted to expand American influence into other parts of the world. Americans who fused the concepts of social Darwinism, eugenics, and racial science with a sense of morality and progressivism believed that they had a right and a responsibility to conquer the world. Now, remember, social Darwinism is this idea that as a nation, certain people are going to be more successful and more able to survive, and those who are inferior for whatever reason should be sort of left to their own demise. Eugenics becomes a very popular idea, which is this idea that um, only those who are most capable, fit, should reproduce. And this is, of course, fused with these racial science ideas. Again, you can't see, but I'm doing air quotes with racial science because this is, of course, a racist mindset. But the idea was simply that those of inferior races should not reproduce and that they were inferior and therefore should not be given equal status. Among those who used the moral argument fused with scientific racism to promote imperialism was Congregationalist minister Josiah Strong, who wrote in his 1885 work, Our Country, that the descendants of the white northern Europeans were obligated to spread Christianity throughout the world. Secular arguments promoted imperialism along similar lines. Historian John Fiske argued that the spread of civilization from England to the United States had laid the groundwork for the spreading of Anglo culture throughout the rest of the world. Now, most businessmen used religion to justify their overseas expansion, and they also encouraged the broad spread of Christianity throughout the world. Again, the idea here was that this Anglo-European Christian culture was superior to all other cultures, and that as Christians, there was a responsibility to sort of save the savage, if you will. And by this, the idea was that anyone who was not a part of this superior culture was savage. In 1895, John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Cyrus McCormick established the World Student Christian Federation, which was an organization that sent more than 5,000 missionaries around the world. Nearly every country that was at the center of economic interest became a center for American religious expression as well. Now, what that should tell you is that business success becomes fused with the success of religion. Missionaries who sought to spread Christianity into China also hoped to spread the desire for an American way of life, particularly the consumption of American-made products. Now, the process of industrialization created what was called a crisis of masculinity. Now, remember what we saw with the rise of industrialism was that more and more men took what was called white collar jobs. So they worked in businesses, they worked in offices, they were managers, they were accountants. They did jobs that were more inside and less manual, less physical. And as a result of that, what we see is that by the end of the 1900s, by the end of the 19th century, what's taking place is that men are feeling that they are no longer um, the force of power and strength in their communities, in their homes, and in their businesses. And so remember from chapter 19, we see men take to sports like baseball and boxing and eventually bare knuckle boxing, so something that is very, very physical. And this is really feeding into this idea that there is a crisis of masculinity, that men are no longer the masculine, rugged, individualist, cowboy type people who have rough and calloused hands and are very, very much manly men. Now, this crisis of masculinity is really created by industrialization, and this trend really bleeds into the imperialist movement, in part because those who believe that since the Civil War, American men had failed to find venues to exhibit and enhance their manhood. It is now the end of the 1800s. There has not been a real there hasn't been any war since the end of the Civil War. And so men, particularly young men coming of age, haven't had a chance to sort of go out and prove themselves as men. Anxieties about the expression of masculinity cut across class lines. So this wasn't just something that impacted poorer classes of men. Particularly in the context of the Depression of the 1890s, economic difficulties clashed with the masculine obligation to support and sustain families. Remember, it's always been, to this point in American history, the responsibility of the man, the father, the husband, to provide for his family. And women were not really expected to work outside of the home. And in cases where a woman might work outside of the home, that was really a negative because it meant that her husband could not provide. Recall from chapter 19 that women who did work worked inside of the home. They did piecework and things like that at home during the day. Women who were unmarried certainly did work, but once a woman was married, the expectation was that she would quit her job. And so what we're seeing is that men really feel like they have not had the opportunity to go out and prove themselves. And women sort of feel this way as well because their roles have changed with the increase of industrialization, where women are working more and in different ways than they have in the past. Now, in 1899, the British poet Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem, and the poem was entitled The White Man's Burden. And the poem really encouraged white men to civilize non-Western peoples in order to refine their own masculinity. Men became increasingly concerned about the regaining and retaining of their masculinity. Because at the same time, women are becoming more engaged in politics. They are advocating for the right to vote. Some states are allowing women to vote. And women are also embracing humanitarian reform. So women are advocating for equal wages, for shorter work days, for a decrease in child labor. They are also working to promote moral uplift, again, suffrage, and other political changes. Now, a gentleman named Alfred Thayer Mahan argued that if women won the right to vote, they would pose a threat to American military security. The argument that Mahan kind of posits is that if women are able to vote, then they will be exchanging and kind of taking part in this very dirty activity of being engaged in politics. And he kind of believes that women would not make good decisions. They would make decisions with feeling and emotion. And that kind of thought process would really make the United States appear very weak to the rest of the world. Now, men who embraced and sought out war were called jingoists. Mahan, Theodore Roosevelt, and other war enthusiasts argued that adult males of the late 19th century needed a war to prove their manhood. This militarism led to efforts to increase the size of the Navy, and by 1900, the U.S. fleet boasted 17 battleships, 6 armored cruisers, and became the third most powerful navy in the world. Now, this was a great time to be expanding in terms of battleships and cruisers because we are in the midst of an industrial period in which it is very easy to produce large ships very quickly. Now, in 1895, the Cubans were fighting for independence from Spain. Remember, Spain was one of the earliest nations to really begin to explore, settle, and colonize the Americas. And Spain has been in Cuba, in this area, since the 1500s. Part of a broad effort to improve the living conditions for the peasants and racial equality for Afro-Cubans who had been free from slavery for less than 10 years are the people who are really advocating to be separated from Spain. Now, we talk a lot about slavery in the United States in American History 1, but it's important to note that African slaves were brought to other parts of Latin America as slaves by various groups at the same time that slaves were being brought into what becomes the United States. Now, the Cuban rebels were vastly outnumbered by the Spanish troops. They also were outnumbered in terms of weapons, military technology, just kind of the ability to fight gun for gun. But the Cuban rebels, and it's important to note here that the word rebel just really means the group that is in opposition to the group that's in power. We tend to think of the word rebel as a negative word. The Cuban rebels fought mightily against the Spanish using guerrilla warfare. And what guerrilla warfare means is that they didn't walk out onto a battlefield with a gun, man for man, gun for gun, and pull the trigger. These guerrilla tactics that were employed by the Cuban rebels would be to hide, lay in wait, to plan sneak or stealth attacks. The rebellion spread across all of Cuba in less than a year and a half. Now, at this particular time, most of Cuba is very disconnected and isolated. So, the popularity of this rebellion is important to understand. The Spanish flexed their military muscle through brutal tactics, and this really, rather than defeat the Cubans, it actually increased their resolve. By the end of 1897, seeing that there was no path to victory, the Spanish offered the Cuban rebels home rule within the Spanish Empire. So the Spanish recognized that because the Cubans are much more familiar with the terrain and they have a personal investment in the outcome of this war, that there's really no way for the Spanish to defeat the spirit of revolution, and there's no way for them, the Spanish, to quash this rebellion. So the Spanish kind of say, okay, we realize that the Cubans are never going to give up, but we don't want to lose and sort of surrender. We don't want to kind of give any of our other imperial territories the notion that they can resist Spanish rule. So they say, hey, you guys can rule yourselves, but you'll still be a part of the Spanish Empire. And the Cubans said, no, that's not good enough, and they held out for full-fledged independence. Nearly one-fourth of all Spanish troops in Cuba became sick with yellow fever or malaria. Now, remember, these are diseases that really come about for a variety of reasons. Some of it is connected to being able to stay clean. Some of it's is connected to poor water, things of that nature. But the Cubans, because they are most familiar with the territory, are actually more resistant to these diseases. Cuban forces relied on the tropical climate as a key weapon in fighting the Spanish. Now, if you're not familiar, it gets really hot and nasty in Cuba, particularly in the summertime. And this was not a type of climate or terrain that the Spanish military was used to. And so this is really an advantage for the Cubans. In addition, the Spanish military was heavily taxed by its simultaneous presence in Africa, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. So remember, the Spanish are really unwilling to give a victory to the Cubans because they don't want these other areas where they are colonizing, settling, ruling to get the same idea and try to push them out. So the Spanish are in Africa, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. So that makes it very difficult for them to concentrate all of their efforts and resources on winning this battle in Cuba. A rebellion by the Spanish troops in Havana on January 12, 1898, heightened the overextension of the Spanish military and really kind of increases the hopes that the Cubans can win this conflict. Now, Americans embraced military intervention in Cuba, just as this victory in Cuba really seems inevitable. And this really strengthens the United States' role in shaping post-war Cuba and in protecting the interests of American businesses and landowners in Cuba. So it's important to understand that the American military does become involved in what's going on in Cuba in this Cuban rebellion, but not early in the rebellion. The Americans become involved late in the game. The build-up to the war fostered the growth of a new journalistic style called yellow journalism, which is similar to muckraking, which we talked about in Chapter 19, Yellow journalism utilizes sensationalist stories to highlight the Spanish atrocities and rally American moral sentiment in favor of an intervention. Now, on February 15th, so this is just a month after the Spanish military resists Spanish authority in Havana, on February 15th, 1898, the U.S. battleship the Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 266 sailors and further rallying American sentiment in favor of intervention against the Spanish, despite the lack of evidence that Spain was actually responsible for the explosion. On April 11th, so this is just under 2 months later, April 11th, 1898, McKinley asked Congress to declare war against Spain, with the stated goal of helping Cuba to win its independence, but also with the interest in maintaining an American stake in Cuba's post-war affairs until the nation was able to be stabilized. The U.S. officially went to war with Spain on April 21st in 1898. Now, again, just to make sure we understand, when McKinley asked Congress to declare war against Spain, he really says, we as Americans need to be concerned about what's taking place in Cuba. He highlights the proximity of Cuba to the United States. He discusses the fact that the Spanish are sort of ruling or colonizing an area. And most Americans really believe in this idea that people should be able to govern themselves independently. With the onset of war, McKinley embraced the imperialist mood of the 1890s and used the context to formally annex Hawaii and to promote imperial impulses among U.S. businessmen. So at the same time that things are heating up in Latin America, particularly in Cuba, there's this surge of imperialist idealism in the United States. And with that surge in imperialist ideas, McKinley formally does annex Hawaii to the United States. Though the United States was eager, its forces were very much unprepared. The 30,000 Army troops and 200,000 National Guard troops and volunteers had insufficient supplies, heavy uniforms, and no immunity from the same tropical diseases that had decimated the Spanish troops. Now, remember, Cuba is a tropical area. Now, it does get hot in the south in the summer times and even sometimes later in the year in the United States. But the men who were fighting, who had served in the military, were still serving in the military in the United States, had thick, heavy wool uniforms. They did have, some of them had weapons, some of them had some supplies, but they didn't necessarily have the things that they needed to live and be deployed, if you will, into Cuba. And maybe most importantly, they were as vulnerable to the diseases in Cuba as the Spanish had been. In spite of the challenges, the Cubans had weakened the Spanish forces, and Theodore Roosevelt resigned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to organize his own regiment known as the Rough Riders. African Americans made up about 1/4 of troops heading to Cuba, but their involvement was not without conflict. Now again, this is 1898. Slavery has not been legal in the United States since the end of the Civil War. African American men have the right to vote in the United States, but we've also seen this increase of violence towards African Americans after 1877, after the Reconstruction period, and we see that really begin to increase in the 1890s. But 1/4 of the men who go to Cuba to help this Cuban Revolution to push the Spanish out of Cuba are actually Black. In Tampa, Florida, on June 8th, 1898, drunk white soldiers shot at a 2-year-old Black boy. A bullet pierced his shirt sleeve, and in response to this, Black soldiers engaged in a shooting match with white soldiers that left 27 Blacks and 3 whites wounded. In spite of the various challenges, the United States won the war in Cuba in just 4 months, losing 460 men in combat and more than 5,000 to disease. So again, 460 men die in combat in Cuba, but more than 5,000 actually die from disease. The quick victory, again, just a few months, the quick victory prompted the Secretary of State, John Hay, to declare it a splendid little war. So now Cuba is free of Spanish influence. The Spanish have been defeated, and in theory, right, in theory, Cuba is now free of imperial rule. In 1898, Congress adopted the Teller Amendment, which pledged Cuba's independence, but McKinley and other leaders argued that Cuba could not be independent until it was pacified. Americans believed that they had liberated Cuba from Spain, in spite of the fact that Cuba had done most of the work before the U.S. forces arrived. Racial prejudice informed the way that the United States behaved in relation to Cuban sovereignty. Remember, the majority of these people who are leading this Cuban Revolution, many of them are Afro-Cuban because there has been a tremendous influence of African slaves who had been introduced into the territory. So most of the people in Cuba are either Cuban or Afro-Cuban, and they are the ones who really led and did the work for this revolution. The U.S. military occupied Cuba until 1902, when Cuba adopted a constitution that was similar to that of the United States. But the document included an amendment that put strict limitations on Cuban sovereignty. Passed by Congress in 1901, the Platt Amendment banned the Cuban government from entering into any treaties without U.S. approval. It also allowed the United States to step in whenever Cuba's economic stability was threatened, because most Americans, particularly businessmen, recognized that Cuba's economic stability could have a significant impact on American economic stability. And then finally, the Platt Amendment leased Guantanamo Bay to the United States as a naval base. Now, remember, the United States has annexed Hawaii, but before that, they had naval rights to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Now, the United States has a Navy base at Guantanamo Bay. So that gives the United States military the ability to station troops in that area if they need to, and defend Cuba, which is really, in their mindset, defending the United States. After 1902, the United States remained a presence in Cuba, establishing it as a protectorate as a means of maintaining U.S. economic and military stability and authority on the island. Now, On May 1st, 1898, so 1898 is a pretty revolutionary year. On May 1st, 1898, Commodore George Dewey of the U.S. Pacific Fleet led an attack on a Spanish flotilla in Manila Bay in the Philippines. 2.5 months later, the U.S. troops invaded Manila, which prompted the Spanish to surrender. Now, the Spanish have been in the Philippines for a while, as well as Africa, recall. And this is becoming an area where the United States has interests in conducting business. The Philippine Islands were constantly in the U.S. consciousness during the battle in Cuba. The United States hoped to maintain a presence in the islands as a stepping stone to China and as a potential military station. Remember, the United States has become very industrial, and so they are looking to increase their markets globally. They also want to be able to have a military station in different parts of the world to help to protect the United States, as well as to help stabilize these smaller nations, these smaller islands. A significant component of U.S. interest in the Philippines came from the idea that if the United States did not take control in these islands, then some other European power would. And that's certainly not an insane idea, because all of the larger European powers are competing for influence, and so they are attempting to colonize and spread their ideas. The French are doing it in what will become Vietnam. The British are doing this in parts of the world, particularly Africa, places like that. The Soviet Union as well is attempting to spread their influence. So any large nation is trying to spread their influence at this particular time. A significant component, again, is really connected to ensuring that the United States is able to compete with the rest of these larger powers. Now, McKinley set out to annex the Philippines, arguing that beyond the strategic interest to the United States, the inhabitants of the Philippines were uncivilized and thus unable to govern themselves. With this motivation, the United States justified its pursuit of control of the Philippines with both cultural supremacist and economic incentives. The imperialist impulse of 1898 was widely supported, but was not without opposition. Andrew Carnegie, Jane Addams, Samuel Gompers, Mark Twain, and other prominent Americans joined the Anti-Imperialist League, which was founded in November of 1898. Now, this Anti-Imperialist League really encompassed a range of opinions on imperialism, including the notion that the United States sacrificed its commitment to and history of independence and liberty to pursue these goals. So, again, men like Carnegie, Twain, Jane Addams, these people, they can't really reconcile imperialism with liberty and independence. They say, hey guys, we are doing to these other parts of the world what we didn't want done to us in the United States. The idea that annexation would bring cheap labor competition to the United States, the argument that the cost of maintaining military forces would be very, very steep, and then a belief that Filipinos were fundamentally incapable of civilization all played into the ideas that were in contrast or ran counter to this idea that the United States should move into these different parts of the world. As in Cuba, the United States entered an existing battle in the Philippines that was initially had already begun. The United States really viewed itself as kind of a liberating force. However, once the United States was successful, we have this mindset of really kind of conquering the area. Filipino forces begin to fight back against the United States, and they use guerrilla tactics and other ways that they are able to kind of resist the United States. The United States really responds in kind of a racist mindset, and they say, well, these people, these Filipinos are really savages, and they need kind of this force for good to tell them how to live. The Filipino guerrilla tactics were, I'm sorry, the U.S. forces responded to those tactics, again with racism, and they ended up killing around 200,000 Filipino civilians between the years of 1899 and 1902. Remember, this is at the same time that the United States is in Cuba. Almost 5,000 Americans died in the Philippines, and this contributed to the decline in the morale for war in the United States. This decline in morale, coupled with reports of the atrocities, led to a change in the way that Americans viewed this sort of crisis of masculinity. What they started to see was that maybe this crisis of masculinity, instead of creating masculine, manly men, really created men who were bullies. Now, very quickly, just going to let you see the proximity here of the Philippines to China, which is the area that the United States is very interested in doing business. And then over here, the United States and Cuba. So there is a lot of concern about the proximity of this territory to the United States in terms of the United States' ability to protect itself from some invading force.